I got a question last week, and I was reminded as we were saying the Lord's Prayer that I got that question, and I did happen to do a little study on in the Lord's Prayer where it says, "Lead us not into temptation." Now, some of you, and I was asked a question because does God tempt us? God does not tempt us. Again, it's one of those translations from Greek into English, and the Greek word for temptation means more testing. Now, throughout the whole Bible, God has tested his people. God does not lead us into temptation. The prayer here is really saying that God, do not test us so severely that it will lead us into temptation. So that's basically what's happening with that line. So, are we okay there? So I just thought before I forgot, I better do that. It's a good question, and I thought we all need to hear the answer to that. Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In hell, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in the water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them that they will not also come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." And he said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. A mission, if you will accept it. Cecil Rhodes was an enormously wealthy man, and one day a newspaper man said to him, "You must be very happy." And Rhodes replied, "Happy? No. I spent my life amassing this fortune, only to find that I have spent half of it on doctors to save my life and keep me out of the grave, and the other half on lawyers to keep me out of jail." Guidepost magazine several years ago published an account how a young man, a woman named Mary Bowers McCorrell found an effective weight loss plan. Mary's doctor told her she needed to lose several pounds. I don't know a doctor that don't tell us that. Do you? Never been to one. So she went through many diet plans. Most of us know about that. Counting calories, dietetic food day, she received a pamphlet about a needy person in her mail. Pictured on this pamphlet was a dark-skinned, scrawny, near-skeleton boy. McCrell says that she experienced a kind of spiritual shock treatment at the sight of this starving child. She began to think more seriously how she could take off unnecessary pounds and put them where they needed to be on this starving child. At last I had a spiritual motivation for reducing, she said. Under God's guidance, I formed a practical plan and I carried it through. For a period of 10 days, I only ate 2 meals a day, skipping lunch. Each day at lunch, I sipped a sugar-free drink and looked at the picture of the starving boy. I prayed to God to bless him and let my extra weight be transformed to him or someone like him. For each lunch I admitted I placed in a box for missions, $1 saved. Now there's a diet plan I can recommend. Jesus told a story about a rich man named Dives and a very poor man named Lazarus. Dives drove a Mercedes and lived in a 15-room mansion. Ordered his suits tailor-made from Europe. Poor Lazarus, he was a street person. The public library where he tried to rest during the day, they threw him out. Even the police turned their heads when they drove by because they were tired of taking him to jail for a free meal and a night's lodging. He had nowhere to sleep except on the sidewalk. There was a gate in front of the driveway leading up to Dives' mansion, so Lazarus, tired and hungry, dirty and covered with sores, sat on the sidewalk and propped himself up against the gate to Dives' mansion and tried to sleep. Dives' Dobermans wandered out to see the sleeping man. They perceived that he was no threat and quietly came over and licked the sores on Lazarus' face. Each time that he drove his Mercedes out the gate, Dives looked in disgust at this filthy piece of humanity leaning against his mansion gate and wondered why somebody didn't do something to get people like that off the street. But that's not the end of the story, is it? Both Lazarus and Dives died. Lazarus went to heaven. But poor rich Dives, he went to Hades. The very affluent Dives had made it a personal rule in his early life never to experience any discomfort. It was his conviction that he deserved to travel in style after all. As the commercial says, he was worth it. But now he was experiencing an eternity of dark discomfort. The air conditioner had failed and the water had been turned off. Please, Father Abraham, he cried out, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in the water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. Interesting, isn't it? The Dives is in Hades and Lazarus is in heaven, but Dives still thinks that Lazarus is no more than an airborne. Abraham answers Dives, saying, Son, remember that you in your lifetime received all the good things, whereas Lazarus had suffered all the kinds of indignities, and now he is living the good life, and it is your turn to be uncomfortable. Besides, says Abraham, there is this great chasm between us, and no one can cross from here to there. But please, Father Abraham, cries Dives, I have 5 brothers, and I don't want them to suffer like I am suffering. At least send Lazarus to my house, my father's house, to warn them about the torment that waits. But please, Father Abraham, please. And Abraham said he would not be budged. They have a Bible. Let them read it and take notice. Dives is desperate now, but he says, that's not enough. He moans that if someone were to come from the dead, they would repent. Old Abraham shakes his head. No, if they will not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone rises from the dead. There are at least 3 things that Jesus seems to be saying in this popular story of the rich man who dies and Lazarus. The first is that we are our brother's keeper. Or better yet, your brother's brother. We are living in the day of the me generation. Looking out for number 1 is the style of our time. We don't want to be told that looking out for number 1 is exactly antithetical to the gospel, but it is. In responding to Dives' request, Abraham appeals to Moses and the prophets, and immediately we think of Amos and Micah and of some of the other prophets who challenged Israel to remember its responsibility to the poor. It's all through the Old Testament. You don't even have to open the New. It's all through the Old. And that's what Jesus was talking about. You recall that back that as far as Leviticus, God instructed the farmers of Israel not to take all the grain out of the field nor all the grapes off the vine, but to leave some there for the poor. Ruth, the great-great-grandmother of Jesus, was gleaning in Boaz's field when she caught Boaz's eye. Without that charitable law, many of the poor would doubtless have starved. In Deuteronomy 15, the people are instructed to deal generously with the poor. There is that recognition that while a few poor people are that way because they refuse to work, most are the victims of circumstances that they have no control over. Throughout the entire Bible, Old Testament and New, there is a concern for the poor. Jesus was concerned about the poor. And his story and several of the other teachings reveal, as was the early church, there's no distinction between the personal gospel and the social gospel. In the scriptures, if you love God, you care about all God's people, rich and poor alike. There's a story about when David Rockefeller of Chase Manhattan Bank was traveling through South America. A group of bank officials of the government of Uruguay invited him for lunch, hoping to secure a sizable loan. The affair was held at a club that that was famous locally for its magnificent cold appetizer bar buffet. Rockefeller passed through the first line first, and thinking this was the entire meal, served himself generously. And when seated, he noticed that the others around him had taken much skimpier plates. I have so much, he said to the president of Banco Central, and you have so little. I'm glad you mentioned that, Mr. Rockefeller, interrupted his host, because that is what we want to talk to you about. You and I are not Rockefellers, but we too have so much. Others have so little. Chances are, not so long ago, the 5 billionth baby was born in the world. 5 billion on our planet. Chances are very, very high that that baby will live all his life, or her life, poorly clothed, poorly housed, and poorly fed. That is because most of the babies born today are in so-called third world countries, where poverty is the rule, not the exception. Remember what Dr. Coxon said to us about the yearly income in Liberia was $107 per person. Can you imagine? $107. How far would it take you? Not very far. Most of us have never really seen real poverty. We drive past houses that are run down, see children who are neglected, and we say that is poverty. Not even close. Someone has noted, however, that what impresses people in deprived countries about America is not how wealthy we live, but how the poor live. Our poor are wealthy compared to the poor in many of the developing countries. This is not to say poverty is not a great problem here in America. It is probably more painful to be poor in America than any other country in the world. Because everywhere you look, you see other people with so much. It is to say, however, that we are living in a world where there are millions of persons who are faced with such grim lives that death can even be a welcome prospect. And in Jesus' name, we must care for all those people. There's a second thing to be said. Judgment is a very real fact in our world and in the world to come. It is very difficult for a pastor today to talk about judgment. Why? For one thing, recent surveys indicate that most Americans do not believe in a literal hell. If you don't believe in a literal hell, then you're not going to live and really believe in judgment. Secondly, it's almost impossible to speak from the pulpit without sounding moralistic, even though we see judgment being worked out in people's lives every day. It is difficult to deal with such a grim theme in worship, except perhaps in humor. I heard about one man, a poor man, who had a very difficult mother, and he felt obligated to take care of her. He had a basement apartment built in his home, and a friend of his was visiting, and they were chatting in the room. "I remember," said his friend, "what a difficult time your mother gave you. Where is the old girl now?" Fearing that the conversation would be overheard, the poor man simply pointed in a downward direction. "Well, I'm sorry," said his friend. "I didn't even know she had died." Scholars tell us that Jesus probably did not mean for us to take the story of Dives and Lazarus as a definitive statement of the nature of life after death, but as a firm biblical principle that we will be judged on our treatment of the poor. I don't think that computes to most today. I'm saved. What more is there? You read the Bible. We will all stand before God someday and be judged. And there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And for those of us that Jesus is our salvation, He will be there to comfort us. But we will go through judgment. Scott, there is a most beautiful passage in the book of Job that is paraphrased in the Living Bible, and it says this: "If I have hurt the poor or caused widows to weep, or refused food to the hungry orphans, or if I have seen anyone freezing and not given him clothing, or fleece from my sheep to keep him warm, or if I have taken advantage of an orphan because though I could get away with it, let my arm be torn from its socket, let my shoulder be wrenched out of place. Rather than that, face the judgment sent by God." Job 31, verses 16 to 22. Remember Jesus' parable of the Last Judgment when the sheep and the goats will be divided? What was the decisive factor between heaven and hell? You remember? I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was naked, and you did not clothe me. Now, I am not advocating a theology of works. You do those things because Jesus lives within you. And when Jesus lives within you, you do those works. You don't do those works expecting to get to heaven. It doesn't work that way. First of all, you give your life to Jesus. And then you do those works because He loved you enough to give Himself for you. If we're faithful to the Scriptures as a whole, we have to declare that caring about the down and out is a very important spiritual business. Our country may have learned that lesson the hard way. Germany lay devastated after World War I. Poverty, unemployment provided the fertile ground for the terrible weeds of the Nazi dogma to grow and prosper. It took a Second World War to show us that. It was a mistake to leave your enemy desolate and forsaken. Thus, after World War II, we sought to rebuild our former adversaries, and today, West Germany and Japan are among our finest allies. Dives could not see that how he dealt with a street person outside his gate would determine his own destiny. Many of us may be making that same mistake. We are our brother's keeper, our brother's brother. The problems of the down and out are our problems. It's hard out here, I know. It's easier, in my way of thinking, to live downtown Lansing or Jackson or somewhere. It's a lot easier to reach out and touch the poor. How do we do it? That's the big question. How are we involved with the poor in our surrounding areas? We know they're there, but how do we touch them? that brings us to the final thing to be said. More than ever before, you and I need a mission consciousness. One day, Wilfred Grenfell, a medical missionary to Labrador, was a guest at a dinner in London, together with a number of socially prominent British men and women. During the course of the dinner, the lady seated next to him turned and said, "Is it true, Dr. Grenfell, that you are a missionary?" And Dr. Grenfell looked at her for a moment before replying, "Is it true, madam, that you are not?" It's a powerful question. How would we like to deal with that question when we stand before the throne of God? Is it true that you lived only for yourself and for your family? Is it true that you had opportunities to help the hungry and the thirsty and the lonely and the dying, and you walked by as if they weren't even there? Is it true that you weren't a missionary? Wow, that hurts. God, I come over here every Sunday and I put my money in this jar for missions. Doesn't that count? And somehow I feel that is the question that God poses for each of us today. Florence Havergal wrote the words to the challenging hymn, "Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to you." There is a line in the hymn that says, "Take my silver and my gold, not a mite would I withhold." Florence Havergal meant those words literally. In her writings, we read these beautiful words. "Take my silver and my gold" now means shipping off all my ornaments, including a jewel cabinet, which is really for a countess, to the Church Missionary Society. I don't think I need to tell you that I never packed a box with such pleasure. Have you ever experienced that kind of pleasure? You and I are dives. We know that. We're surrounded by Lazaruses. We have a responsibility, a response to make. We can live our lives as our lives if we were the only ones on this earth who mattered, or we can become missionaries, people living in a mission to other people right here where we are today. The mission is, will you accept it? Amen.